Hey, welcome to the Trinity Podcast. We are on episode 2 of season 3. Thank you for tuning in, whether you're watching or listening. My name is Joel Milligan. I'm going to be your host for today. And today on the podcast, we have a couple of our pastors here. I'll introduce them to you. We have Daniel Warren, who is our executive pastor, Tom Messer, our senior pastor, and then new campus pastor out at our Mandarin location, Jeremiah Stanley is here. Jeremiah, you've made it.
I'm here.
You are on the podcast, but we're glad to have you here. If this is your first time listening, we talked about in season 3, we're going to cut down the length of our podcast to about 30 minutes. So we get to jump right into the conversation today, which if you listened to the podcast last week, today's conversation is a little bit related to our podcast last week. Here's what it is. There was an article written by the Gospel Coalition that the title was 5 Misconceptions About the Dechurching in America. And I want to read a little bit of this article to set up our conversation for today. The article said this: we're currently living in the largest and fastest religious shift in U.S. history. Some 40 million adult Americans who used to go to church at least once a month now attend less than 1 year. This shift is larger, listen to this, than the number of conversions during the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and the totality of the Billy Graham Crusades combined. So actually very alarming. But the Gospel Coalition says they put on the largest and most comprehensive study of dechurching. 7,000 respondents, 600 data points. There's a book that's been published on it. There are write-ups in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. And here is what they learned. People aren't leaving the church for the reasons we thought. After all of that, they have learned, oh, that's not why people are leaving the church. So we're going to pull out 3 of those misconceptions and then just talk about them and hear from your own experience today. Here we go. The first misconception about why people leave the church is this: people leave primarily because of negative experiences with the church that they are attending. People leave primarily because of negative experiences with the church they are attending. So let's start it here.
So are you saying the good news is people don't have negative experiences in church?
No. Those are very real. Negative experiences, church hurt. We talked about some in the last podcast. Abuse. Those are very real problems and reasons why people do leave the church. But why is it an automatic assumption when someone does leave? Why is the automatic assumption something must have happened? Why do we always tend to jump to that conclusion, or we just assume something must have happened, something must have been done, someone must have hurt them? Let's start there.
I think for me, my first thought was when you asked the question, it's because we take it personally, right? And we assume, what did I do that they're not coming back? Because we know it would take something very major for us to not come back to church. So we assume that it must have taken something major for them. We were talking to one of our group leaders who has a very large Sunday morning on-campus group, runs 75 to 90. 1 week he had 90, the next week he had 75. And he said, what did I do last week that caused 15 people not to come back? And we're like, nothing. It's people, But there was an immediate assumption he did something wrong the previous week that caused the attendance to vary by 15%. We talked about that in Mandarin. We notice it because it's a smaller, newer campus. Sure. You feel the flex here. At Hammond, you feel a little bit less, but we always assume it's something personal. And so I think we have to. What did somebody say to them?
Right.
We're sensitive because we don't want to be the reason, and so we assume. I think that a lot of time that's just we take it so personally.
Well, think about too the consumer nature of the world we live in. I mean, Google reviews and I mean one bad experience, one negative thing, and people are just ready to blast. So I think in our minds, we automatically assume, okay, well, they must have had a bad experience or we did something wrong because we're accustomed to that in the culture we live in.
Yeah.
So this morning, my wife and I were having a conversation, and she said, I said to her, we would have a little conversation, but I said to her, I said, I just hate it when I get my feelings hurt. And she said, that's your problem. It's impossible to hurt your feelings. So I never think that I did anything wrong when people leave. I think they did something wrong. It's not, I never think it's on me.
Can you teach me your ways, Pastor? I need to learn that.
No, people are way more resilient than we give them credit for. And I honestly don't think people come to church looking to get their feelings hurt. And so it actually doesn't surprise me. I think there are probably more substantial reasons. And again, some of this is, I've been doing this for a long time. And after you have a lot of conversations with people, there's very few people that leave the church that you may not agree with their reason, but there's some validity behind. It's a process that they've thought through and they've worked out. You may disagree. You may think the issues can be addressed. It does not surprise me at all that it's people that move, because the other reverse side of that is the single greatest reason people come to our church is they move into the area. And they're in time of transition in their life, right? Or they've moved. A lot of people, even over the last several years, a lot of people that have connected to our church have moved to Jacksonville and have been out of church for several years. It's kind of been the last thing on their list to do as they relocated. So it does make, it makes sense. I think going to Daniel's illustration, which is really valid, if people only have one touch point to a church, if that touch point fails, there's likely to be a failure.
Right.
If they have multiple touch points, you can have a bad experience in a touch point, but the other touch points are strong enough that prevent you. So like example, somebody that's connected to a small group, but that small group experience is not great, but their kids are deeply connected to children's ministry. It's hard to pull your kids out of something that they're thriving in because your experience is less than.
Yeah, but going back to your point, why do we think that? I think that's the narrative that society gives. That's what we hear. Is the church is just full of hurt and bad experiences, and so we automatically assume that because that's what culture is saying that church is causing to happen. So it can cause us to think that automatically.
So the findings were, which one that you just mentioned, Pastor, is a lot of people leave a church not because of that experience, just because simply they've moved and a job has pulled them to a different place, which is understandable. But it also references some other, what they would call pedestrian reasons of why people leave a church. And I want to just talk to you about how you can combat those reasons from sports. Sports is huge, and there's travel ball and clubs, and kids no longer play sports during a season. It is the entire year. Sports take them out. Family occasions, things that change like marriage or having a child. Sometimes divorce can switch that up. How can people combat these reasons? And then I'll use a value of our church is we want people to commit deeply to the local church. Actually, it's a mark of our church. We want to commit deeply. What are some ways that you can encourage someone and challenge them to get connected deeper into church and not let those pedestrian reasons keep them from connecting to church?
Can we go back maybe just a little bit? So I think from just a perspective I would give is this is just a trend that has been happening for a longer time, but COVID made it more evident. In other words, the slide away from church was happening well before the pandemic happened. The pandemic just gave a reason for, okay, well, I'm not going to go to church. I already have been slipping away from church for a while, but now this has kind of built an excuse for me to go ahead and prioritize fully what I already was prioritizing in terms of my schedule. So maybe it just provided an opportunity for us to see the trend that was already beginning to happen, that life is busier than it has been in maybe generations, and we have more things that are pulling at us and more things that are prioritizing our time. And so now I think we have to come back and say, okay, how do we balance that? How do we find a way to maintain a priority on church, but also do the things that all the kids want to do and that we want to do? It's tough.
That's great. It almost gave permission to kind of not going to church during COVID gave permission to kind of, okay, this is going to be my new priorities, my new way of life. What are some of those touch points? Pastor, you mentioned one, but what are some touch points that you think really do connect people deeper into the local church?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. So in fairness, I'm kind of living this on a personal basis. My grandson is very involved in sports and is on multiple travel teams.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing the conflict and the extra effort that has to be made not to cause missing church to become a regular, pattern for them. Okay. And, but I think there's a couple things. One, I think you have to teach clearly about it. And when I say clearly, you have to be teaching that all of life requires priorities. And that starts with, it's where does God fit into your priority? Now you have to be careful you don't legalistically approach it or selfishly approach it. But one, it's a teaching point. I think secondly, it's a discipleship point, and you have to keep calling people to follow Jesus. And then I think in some of the things that we're talking about, and I'm talking about from church life, is that if people's only experience with church is I come to be a spectator, it's easy to trade off. I'm not going to do Sunday because I have this, right? If you can push towards, hey, we meet as a body, not just because we want X number of people to sit in a room to listen to one guy teach. We meet together to express worship, and part of that is I'm using my gifting, my talents, my abilities to serve the body of Christ and to express the gospel in a corporate worship experience. Then people begin to say, hey, I have an obligation there. I'm as obligated to that as I am to everything. So I think that's where, and of course, children's ministry, student ministry, all that fits in there. But I think you have to take that kind of approach. And then I think the other part of it is we are in need of spiritual renewal. And I think, the older I get, the more I think that a strategy is pastoral prayer. We have to go to battle for the souls of people and the spiritual work of God in the hearts and lives of people that you're trying to lead and pastor.
So, two really important points you made there. One, the prioritization piece of it. That yes, sometimes in our life we have to make decisions between, hey, this is a good thing, but this is a more important thing. So that is valid. But then also the aspect of the church sometimes we have to keep that in mind, that if we're programming people to where we expect them to be there. I mean, I know that was my experience both growing up and when our boys were younger. I felt that pressure of Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, plus activities and other events. So I think from a church, maybe there's a responsibility we have to rethink, what are we asking people to do? What is a committed church member? What is the definition of that?
I think that, because culturally, and we talk about this, I've had this conversation with my wife, because my daughter's 13, my oldest son's 28, my boys are in their 20s, my daughter's in middle school. They are living very different. She has a very different church experience than my boys did, and they give us a hard time about it.
I'm sure
all
they
the time.
do.
And I'm sure their experience was when the doors are open.
And the doors were open all the time. And so it's really different. And I think we have to recognize that highly programmed 3 times a week plus all the other things, that was a 20th century unique phenomenon.
Sure.
In 20 centuries of church life, only 1 century was that programmed, and it was the 20th century. And I think we have to recognize that. And if, as culture changes, the builders and the boomers, the builders were building a society that was very programmed driven. And then that whole society was built around Judeo-Christian values and church involvement, so much so that most stores were not open on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Nobody had practices or things on Wednesday night. I mean, we played Little League and nobody had practices on Wednesday night. Right. Well, now I'm negotiating with my daughter's volleyball club. Hey, she can't be at practice on Wednesday night, so don't schedule her team on that. And it's this thing because we're trying to do that. So the culture, but how do we be missionally? How do we align our programs to accomplish our mission in the culture that we are currently living in, not expecting culture to adapt to our worst case, without trying to think of a better word, our archaic programming schedule, which I think is
or
we
the
got to
legalistic part of that.
correct. We got to. I think it's hard, and I think we got to help people. I think there's a difference between, hey, I'm doing this, and so it's interrupting my regular attendance. And here we're talking about people who actually walk away from the church because of it.
Right.
I do think there is that, if you will, slippery slope. And just reading the notes for this before going in, I was thinking, this is how I went from 3 years ago being at the gym 5 days a week to now. It's been a while since I am de-gymmed, and it was not because I had a negative experience with the gym. It wasn't because I don't believe in this anymore. It patterned, things disrupted my attendance. I hurt my knee, then I stop. Then it was painful to go back, and it's not worth it. And 20 pounds later, here I am. And so that
you get out of the habit,
right? It really was pedestrian reasons. It was not that this gym did something and I got offended by the personal trainer, or it wasn't even that it wasn't bringing value to my life. It was I got out of the habit. It was a very pedestrian reason, and I think we have to be. I think that idea. How do we help people? We have to recognize that is human tendency, and while there's nothing, you're not going to lose your place on God's honor roll by missing for a season because of a sport thing, or missing here or there, or going less than 3 times a week, but seemingly insignificant events gain value over time. Right. And so missing them also, there's devaluing over time. And the next thing you know, you're de-churched and you never thought you would be.
And just to kind of complete that thought, and as a reminder to all of us, and I think even for people that are listening to this, that's why it's a constant challenge for all churches. And I think particularly churches like ours, when you get larger and you get multi-service, multi-campus, whatever, that you have to create systems of known, loved, cared for, held accountable. And that's not just a slogan. And just because we say it doesn't mean that we're executing it perfectly or at the quality level. But that's why small groups really matter. There's lots of times I look up on a Sunday morning and think, I haven't seen that person for a while. Or I'll look up on Sunday morning and say, where are those people? They never miss. But I don't think a lot about it. And it may not cross back my mind again until weeks later. But if people are being lovingly challenged to be into small groups and have small group connection, then they are known. Yep. They're being loved. They're being cared for. And at some level, they're being held accountable so that when they go through those seasons of life, I think somebody can be out of church and still connected to church.
That's a good point.
Right? Being out of church and disconnected from church is an unhealthy thing. Yeah. Being out of church and still being connected to church can be a lifesaver for people. Right. And that's where the system and process side of church life becomes incredibly valuable.
Yeah, just to speak to that, just something small in our student ministry, we try to do our best to obviously keep track of when kids have not attended for a while. And there's something little that we have the opportunity to do once a month. I'll just send a card to a teenager that says, hey, we miss you. Haven't seen you this month. And it's so interesting that that card's not used to guilt that teenager in. But so many times I get the feedback from a teenager of, they were glad that we realized they weren't there. And it kind of made them feel
and that tells me we should have some kind of system like that, even on an adult level. Yeah. People want to know.
Somebody missed me.
I was missed. You knew. Yep. I matter enough that you actually know. Yeah.
You tied this back to our mark. We have 5 marks that we think we should be helping people grow in spiritually. And one of those is that disciples commit deeply to a local church.
Yeah.
You know what the 5 qualifiers for that are? One is I make weekly Sunday church service a priority in my life. That's what we're talking about. There's 4 more. 80% of this mark is outside of that. It's I'm serving regularly in a ministry of the church. That's a connection point.
Yeah.
And so even if your attendance because of a season is drifting or going through a less consistent time, are you serving? I'm intentionally cultivating relationships with Christian friends and spiritual mentors. That's that relational connection. I'm investing in the spiritual life of another person or a group. That's group involvement. And then I have a sense of community with a group of people in our church where we care for and feel responsible for each other. And if you're like, yeah, I'm missing more church because of work or kids or whatever, but man, I'm still trying to do these other things, then the season will shift, and we need to give people freedom for that. But the anchor and the spiritual development, which is the real goal, that program attendance is a vehicle to accomplish this goal.
Yeah.
That's a great point, and I think, not to beat the dead horse, but I think we unintentionally have overvalued the Sunday morning worship gathering to the degree that anything else has become insignificantly important. When in reality, if you did those other 4 things and you missed the primary worship gathering, you probably are in a really healthy place spiritually. And we have people who are leading and making church happen on Sunday morning that never make it to the large worship gathering, but they do those other 4
And
things.
Spiritual growth is the goal.
And we've simplified it to, we've also said, hey, as long as you're in church every week, you're okay. But that's only 20% of the committing to a church deeply. And we have people who don't do any of the other, but they're here every Sunday, but they're consumers, they're spectators, they're consuming the content and listening, but they're not investing in relationships and ministry in that depth. So I think that's a way we can help people any false guilt we can dissolve, any real
I think
challenge.
That's the church taking ownership.
Yeah.
That this whole dechurching thing. So in a relationship, it's like, okay, what's all your fault and not mine? Well, the church's stance can't be that. It can't be, well, that's the problem of the congregants.
For sure.
It's like, no, there are things that maybe we're doing intentionally or unintentionally to help contribute to this problem. So I think what we're addressing here is like, hey, these are things the church can fine-tune or redevelop, reconstruct to be able to make that experience a win for everybody.
Right.
Misconception number 2. That was really good. Misconception number 2. People leave the church because they've left the faith. And we talked about that some on the last podcast. But let me read you real quick the findings, and then we can briefly talk about this one. It says the algorithm identified several profiles of de-churched people. 98% of a group that they've called the de-churched mainstream evangelicals. And 97% of evangelicals agreed that Jesus is the Son of God. So while they left the church, clearly not all have left an orthodox confession. Somehow, mainstream evangelicals, the dropouts, registered a higher orthodoxy score and view of Jesus than evangelicals who still attend church. So let's talk about that little part right there. The misconception is people leave the church because they left their faith. It says a lot of people that have left the church actually score higher on their orthodoxy beliefs than people who still attend church. Why do you think that is? And why do you think that was something that they came across, a finding there?
It's really intriguing. I'm trying to get my mind around that fully.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the people that are in the church, maybe these are new believers, newer converts that don't have the depth in their understanding of scripture or theology. Maybe that's a contributing factor to it. But those who are outside, maybe they grew up in it, they have the knowledge there, maybe they're not applying it, but they know more about it. So that could be a factor as well.
Yeah. Or they've become disillusioned with the machine.
Right.
And I think that is some of that church hurt, or whether it's church hurt or disillusionment, in this group, or, man, no, I really believe everything.
Sure.
I drifted away. I just got out of the habit. And so they're not I think that is part of that dechurched mainstream, is that group that we just identified, that 75% of them don't leave because of a break in orthodoxy or something happened at the church.
But you think about the headlines, though, that the attention grabbers are the ones that, we can name names of like, hey, these people, they grew up in church, they wrote books, they were influential, and all of a sudden now they're walking away. Well, that's going to garner a lot of attention. That makes for a great news story.
For that
but
evangelical.
That may not be where everybody is at.
I don't even want to be part of that group anymore because of these high profile things.
I think there's a couple phenomena. I mean, that is an interesting thing, and I'd have to really think about it for a while. But just here's a couple quick comeback thoughts that I would say. They denote in that article that there's a difference between what happens in mainstream evangelical churches, which I'm believing they're probably referring to more mainline evangelical, and think our context would not be mainline denominationalism.
Right.
Okay, so those are two different things, and we've had some of that experience here where we have people coming who've left mainline denominational churches and have come here because mainline denominational churches largely reacted much stronger to COVID than what we did. And not saying it's right or wrong, just that was a reality that occurred. In the previous podcast when we talked about deconstruction, I do think that this is real. If a person grows up culturally and they've been to church as a child, and they grew up in a family that faith had some level of importance and priority. If you ask those people when they're in their 30s or 40s, what do you believe? They are probably going to tell you what they were taught as a child, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean that that's real to them. Which is what I referred to in the last podcast. They know that honey is sweet because they've been told all their life that honey is sweet, but they've never tasted it for themselves and had a real experience. Now, my guess is that's probably somewhat embedded into that kind of experience. Yeah. And it becomes a challenge for us, is that I think you can get kids to be faithful to church when their parents are bringing them. And we all see it, right? Yeah. What happens to a kid when he can drive himself? What happens to a kid when his parents let him make his own choices?
Right.
And they go through these periods of time where they have to decide, do I just believe this, and is this important to me because it was important to my parents, it was a part of my upbringing, or do I believe this and is it important to me because I have embraced this?
Yeah, part of it could be too that culturally we live much more conservative, even outside of the church, than often we talk. So that's more ingrained into the fabric and culture of our lives, that we may say, oh yeah, we want to have these more progressive, viewpoints, but we don't actually practice that in our own lives. And so maybe that has more bearing on the way we answer questions too.
Yeah. And they actually found in the study that people that had left the church, they put more significance on belonging than in the actual issue of their beliefs. So let's talk about that just for a second. Why do you think that belonging is so much of a priority that actually caused them to leave the church because they felt like they didn't belong?
Well, I'm not sure I'd like to know a little bit more about that. My guess is that is getting a little bit into the irrelevancy of their experience in church, and they've put more value on that than they have on, in other words, it's easy for me to say, yeah, I still believe that. This is just not working for me here. And it's, I shop at the same stores because I'm comfortable with that experience. I don't want to go looking for a new store because I don't want the new experience. I think if somebody leaves a church, sometimes they just drop out of church because they don't want to go through the experience of shopping for a new one, and I think, I don't know, that would be my top of mind take on that.
Yeah, or maybe they're prioritizing the felt needs over just biblical faithfulness and needing to anchor into that. Because I know oftentimes people give reasons for leaving church that they're not based on anything to do with theology. It's felt needs. I didn't like that experience. I had a bad relational situation, or my kids didn't have a good experience. And so those tend to be far more the reasons for leaving church than my pastor is preaching heresy.
Right.
That's not as common.
Yeah, and there's the stickiness is in the relationship, and I think we need that. Culturally, there's this. We've done podcasts on the isolationism and the drift toward isolationism, and looking for community. And if they're not finding it in the church, they can get information from a million places.
Sure,
and they have access through this, through a device, to the best teachers, and all the content in the world is at my fingertips. But this can't provide me community. And so if they're coming and they're getting information without community and belonging, that's going to be frustrating. They're going to go look for belonging, whether it's through some of these pedestrian clubs and activities, or family, and then they find content.
Maybe too, it's a misunderstanding of like what the church is supposed to be accomplishing. So you talked about the club. I mean, the club, you go into a situation like that, and you have like-mindedness. So you have people who they have the same values. They're pursuing the same things, same hobbies, what have you. You go into a church situation, you got a very diverse situation. You've got different personalities, different backgrounds, all kinds of different, and that's the way God designed church. Like, we're not supposed to come in and just have this great experience where I get along with everybody and we all love each other and it's just happy. We sing Kumbaya together. Like, the purpose of the church, that sanctifying element, is that I go in and I have difficult relationships and we work through that together, and you sharpen me and I'm sharpened by you because we have different ways of looking at it. But the bond, the unity, is Christ. That's what brings us together. So it's a much different experience than we have in other places of life where we go, and if these boxes aren't checked, then I'm out.
Yeah. Well, here's the silver lining to the study. The last misconception is that people have been de-churched. They aren't willing to come back. The silver lining, though, is the article says the single best piece of good news to come from our study is that more than half of those who have left the church are willing to come back. That's nearly 8 million de-church evangelicals are willing to come back to church. But here are the two factors that they listed. They're willing to come back to church for healthy relationships and a local church that actively demonstrates how the gospel is true, good, and beautiful. So how can we address those two factors to bring the de-churched back into the church family? Healthy relationships, and that the gospel is true, good, and beautiful.
I think our small groups expert should answer that question first.
My first thought, from a system as a church leader, and as if you're a church member listening to this, we have to have structures that engage in healthy relationships. And we have to have people willing to leverage those structures to engage in healthy relationships. So small group isn't about coming and listening to a lesson. It is about engaging relationally. It's about life together. We grow together. And we talk about our small groups are to connect relationally, build the sense of community so that we can help each other grow spiritually. And so group leaders, group participants, you have to be willing to use your group time, not to just come sit in a chair and listen to your teacher teach if it's in a teaching mode, but really engage in life together and be willing to bring people into a healthy relational context. And then I think for the teaching team, the gospel side of it, I'm going to let Pastor speak to that, to leverage the gospel as our real basis.
Yeah, I think good teaching is really important, but I also think we don't sometimes do a good job of intentionally connecting what we're doing missionally as a church to gospel truth and reality. And think about this, I'll just take one example, and this is part of the series we're currently teaching, or we just finished teaching. But Jesus, in validating his ministry to John the Baptist, said, the blind see, the dead are raised, the lepers are cleansed, and and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Now that's really interesting. Well, the poor have the gospel preached to them. He doesn't say the poor are given money so that they can become not poor, right? He says the poor have the gospel preached to them. Well, obviously the primary lesson is that the poor in spirit are the ones that are hearing the gospel, right? Well, we do this massive thing. We help a lot of people at major expense, major focus. I just was in a very, very deep conversation yesterday about how even raising our tuition prices for our schools, my great apprehension about that, even though I know the cost of what the costs are for us to execute and to provide the product, if it makes it difficult for a poorer family, a family that has less capacity financially to put their children in our school, that's a problem. And that should weigh heavily on us. We do ministry to the tunes of $1,800,000 a year for homeless and addicted and misplaced, marginalized people in Jacksonville. We don't do a good job of talking about how we're living out the beauty of the gospel in that. And we could have a lot more money to do things that are programmatically fun to do. Right? But we're committed to that because it is the gospel. Now those may feel a little extreme, but we give money generously to missionaries, and we spent a good part of the afternoon yesterday talking about how do we communicate this to our church? How do we engage our church people? Because we really believe the gospel should get to people in places where it's not yet been readily available. It's way more readily available than we are. And we don't think about that in terms of ones or twos. We think about that in terms of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so when you look at what we invest in schools and education, what we invest in homelessness and addiction, and what we invest in missions, really a lot of what we're doing is being able to provide the beauty of the gospel to people. And when we had 162 kids come to faith in Jesus in our academy last year, that's powerful. And when we have college graduates by the hundreds that are pastoring and leading in ministries and are impacting people, that's powerful. And so I'm not trying to sell our church. I'm trying to say that churches are doing a lot more gospel ministry than we're talking about. And we gotta, people have to wake up to that and say, hey, actually, that is what we're doing. That is powerful. That is life transformation.
Those expressions, the good, the beautiful, the true, I mean, these are classic Christian expressions that talk about God. So like anything that's good, beautiful, and true originates from him. Like the closer you get to him, the more those are going to be seen and profound. So I think for churches, that the more we can reflect the glory of God, the more that we can cause people to worship him, and it not be about what we're doing, about building our little kingdoms. Because I think that's what you see in society today, is you have these churches that are doing that, and so people are using that as an excuse of like, well, yeah, I'm not going to get involved in church because it's all about that pastor or the campuses that they're building or whatever they're doing. And they're not reflecting back to God. And I think the better we do that as a church, the more people will connect and stay connected, because it's not about us. It's about him.
Really good. Great conversation today, everybody. Jeremiah, welcome to the podcast team.
Thank you.
Hey, if you would like to read the article from the Gospel Coalition, we'll link it below in the show notes. Remember, we release a podcast every single week. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or the Trinity app. Right here at Trinity, we want to help everyday people discover an extraordinary life with God. We'll catch you next time.